I think a leader with healthy charisma invites you into a story, helps you see things about your life and the possibilities for your own. I mean, in the context of a church, your own growth as a Christian, your own relationship with God that you hadn't seen before.
I once found myself one of two people left standing while everyone else in the room was on the floor writhing. Wasn't a drug event, wasn't a drunken party. It was a revival meeting. I was a youth pastor, and there was a young woman in our youth group who had started going to this revival that started going through the country at the time. Featured a lot of strange manifestations, laughing and barking and so forth. And so I wanted to go so that I would know how to help her. And so a friend of mine and I went, and we sat through this service where the evangelist stood up and said some really theologically wacky things, but I found myself mesmerized by everything that he said all the way through to the altar call. And after that, he started giving directions to people as to what they were going to experience. And before long, virtually everybody was on the floor. And I remember thinking, this is crazy, but why is everybody else seeming to go along with it? That's what I want to talk about today, because you might not have been to a laughing revival, but you have been in situations where you've experienced charisma. As a matter of fact, our next guest is going to say that you can see the influence of charisma throughout all of American history, church history, and our current moment. Molly Worthen is with us today. She's professor of history at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's written for almost every media outlet you have ever heard of in your life. And she has a new book out, Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. And this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Molly Worthen, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for telling that story. I'm excited to dig into that.
Last time I saw you in person was at Tim Keller's funeral.
That's right.
Why were you there?
I was there because he played a significant role in my conversion to Christianity just about 6 months prior to his death. And I had admired him prior to that, been aware of him, but I'm probably one of his last converts, I suppose. We had a few Zoom conversations and email exchanges as I was doing a lot of reading and investigating and prayer, and he played an enormous role, and so it was a real privilege to be able to attend that service.
You know, you have done a lot of writing about religious movements in the United States, and particularly about evangelical Christianity. Was that kind of a stumbling block for you in considering Christianity?
Was I inoculated against the gospel by my sustained exposure to evangelicals as an observer? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. I mean, you would think that after having seen, I think of the judge in the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker trial, who, when someone called the courthouse and said, I want to know if the judge is a Christian, and the judge said, well, after seeing everything that I've seen, I'm just going to plead the fifth on that. So having been behind the veil of religious life, did you think, wait, I've kind of seen some really bad stuff and some fake stuff too. Did that make it more difficult?
I think there's maybe two answers. I mean, in one sense, no, because the longer you study human history, whether your lane is religious history as is mine, or you focus on economics or the history of anything you could name, as long as you are studying humans, the longer you're in this business, the more you become convinced of the doctrine of original sin. And I will tell you that long before I was even a theist, I had a visceral sense that original sin was the only plausible explanation. And so people have asked, how can you join this group that has done all kinds of things that, have gotten an awful lot of bad press. And I guess I'm certainly aware of it all, but I'm not that impressed, frankly. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't join a human institution or group and not be faced with a legacy of depravity. That's just what it is. Mm-hmm. I do think, though, that my 2 decades roughly of studying American Christianity, punctuated by a couple of incompetent efforts to get myself churched, did get me into the habit of, thinking about Christianity all the time in lots of ways, but never really thinking about Jesus. So there's a sense in which my bandwidth was taken up with matters that frankly are beside the point. And I did need a kind of radical intervention to jostle me out of that. So in that sense, I did have that hurdle as an outsider scholar.
One of the things about Tim Keller, he and I have been together. Well, we were together every week with some atheist friends of ours, and regularly in other contexts. And one of the things that I noticed is Tim was always, in answering their questions and helping them to think through things, kind of anti-charismatic. In the sense he had, of course, his own personal charisma, but he was really gentle, not trying to manipulate people or to press them, and seemed to know that people needed the space to kind of consider what he was saying. Was that your experience as well?
Yeah, yes, it was totally my experience. I remember our first conversation. He wanted to kind of hear my story, so I told him my background and what I was wrestling with, and how I had made these previous efforts to try to become a Christian, and they had failed. And at the end of my little spiel, he kind of leaned back and he said, "I don't know, Molly. Maybe this time you'll become a Christian. Maybe you'll just stall out again. I really don't know." And I was simultaneously getting evangelized by our mutual friend J.D. Greer, who's a classic, very relentless Southern Baptist, yeah. Right? So so Tim's approach was totally different. I almost wondered, is he using reverse psychology, right? Like, what is this? But you're absolutely right. I mean, he didn't want to push anything. There was never anything resembling an altar call in our conversations. And that was a really helpful counterpoint to some of the other contexts in which I was grappling with the gospel.
I once heard him say to an atheist friend who talked about how he was seeking transcendence through psychedelic mushrooms, and that this was his way to have spirituality. And I just saw Tim's one eyebrow go up, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to let him handle this. And he said, well, I mean, I guess what you have to ask yourself is, since you think that's just neurons, what's it really transcending? That was it. And that kind of stayed in the air for a long time. And I thought that was the perfect way to handle it.
That sounds exactly right.
When we talk about this book that you've written, Spellbound, what got you to thinking about charisma? My Gen Z son would not want me to use the word Riz on this program for cringe purposes, so I won't. But it has become, in one sense, part of the lingo of American popular culture right now. What particularly now causes you to think about charisma?
I was interested in finding a new set of tools to investigate what I've always thought are humans' abiding religious impulses. And I mean, religious in the most kind of fundamental non-sectarian sense of a desire to connect our puny mortal story with some transcendent source of meaning, an impulse to worship. And it has seemed to me over the past generation, that every time we get another flood of the social science data tracking the usual markers of religiosity, rates of church attendance, membership, how many Americans say that they believe in God or pray, and so forth, we're used to these numbers generally declining, although there are blips that are interesting here and there. And it seems to me that that is not an indication that human nature is changing in some fundamental way, and we are no longer hungry for those sources of transcendent satisfaction, but rather that set of desires and impulses, it's no longer landing in institutions of organized religion. It's landing somewhere else. So scholars need to be a little more imaginative and ad hoc and creative in investigating that. And so my working hypothesis going into this was that perhaps the charismatic relationships between some leaders and their followers, that's one location where these impulses show up. And I was interested in telling a story that really tries to weave together religion and politics. I think too often religious history exists in kind of its own silo. And this book probably half or more than half of it is about the kind of charisma that you opened this episode with. It's about the, outrageous manifestations of something. In all sorts of different forms, from speaking in tongues to animal noises to holy laughter to trance, all of these ways in which humans have sought these enthusiastic experiences with the supernatural, and who often seem quite bizarre to what I'll call the mainstream of American society. But I'm trying to suggest in the book that story of New Testament charisma is intertwined with the story of charisma in the sense that we use it to talk about politics, and that those figures in our culture who we may see as marginal, as eccentric, as doing something rather odd when they're, lying on the carpet in their church sanctuary, caught in howls of holy laughter, they are not experiencing something wholly distinct from what those of us in the staid mainstream hunger for. Really, theirs is simply the most obvious manifestation of that hunger. And the last thing I'll say is that I was thinking about the beginnings of this project in 2015, 2016, when the country was deeply polarized, by a particular political figure who provoked such different reactions among Americans, right? To some Americans, Donald Trump was so obviously unfit for office and repellent in various ways. And yet this same man giving the same speeches, the same encounters with the press, the same stories about his history provoked the opposite reaction in the other, maybe not half, but a lot of Americans, right? And this combination was interesting to me. And I found that it is a characteristic of charisma across the ages. It tends to repel and revolt as much as it does attract. And that paradox is really interesting to me.
Anybody who's ever been in a room with Bill Clinton, even people who can't stand Bill Clinton politically, they come away, at least for a few minutes, thinking, this is the greatest guy on the face of the planet. He has this sort of hypnotic power over people, and there are certain people like that. I think when people think of charisma, they think of it as something somebody has, like an invisible sort of trait. But you define it in this book as more of a relational power than a personal one.
Well, yeah, I don't think you can have charisma by yourself, locked in a closet, right? I mean, it depends on that interplay between followers and the leader. One of the big surprises to me in my research was going in, I thought that I would be writing a lot about figures who knew how to work a room and transfix someone in a conversation, like Bill Clinton, who had what I would call charm. I thought I would be writing about people who were amazing public speakers, really good looking, great sex appeal. What I found is that those are all part of the mix, and they can go along with charisma. So can celebrity, which is another category I think is distinct and often confused. But I think interpersonal charm of the sort that Clinton had is different from the power to pull people into something that becomes a mass movement. And often the figures who achieve that are not necessarily great public speakers, may not interpersonally be very successful in the context of a cocktail party. Although if they are, that can often help. Someone like John F. Kennedy, would be in that category. But what they really are able to do that sets them apart is they invite the potential followers into a story that gives a better account of the person's miseries and frustrations and struggles, and gives them a role, a sense of at least limited agency that is more compelling than the other narratives that the culture is offering them. And it's this ability to invite into a story that I found was really the through line that helped me see, what was happening in the context of, Puritan Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s, all the way up through our own time. And always it has been a story that offers followers a kind of balance between having a sense of power and agency that they did not have before, but not too much, right? I think as humans, we're afraid of too much responsibility, and we also crave the comfort of turning over a certain amount of accountability for the cosmos to some broader force. And so there's this paradoxical dimension. And when I got into this narrative, in dealing with the Puritans in my early research, I was embedded in, of course, more theological ways of talking about this, and spent a lot of time reading the Puritans on this concept of assurance, and the knowledge that the great heretic Anne Hutchinson promised you could get directly from the Holy Spirit, that you were among the elect. And I find that concept useful, even as we travel into more recent, more secular history. I think it's still something that we crave.
Someone told me not long ago about why in a particular country rates of astrology were going up so high. And he said it actually was because of industrialization, and the people had so many more options in terms of what to do with a career and with a life and where to live. And that was overwhelming. And there was something comforting about knowing there's a certain degree of this that I can't mess up because I'm not in control of it. It's the star system under which I was born. The time that I was born controls some of that. So it's a relieving of that pressure you're talking about.
That's exactly right. And I think astrology, I've seen a real uptick in interest in astrology among my students at UNC. And I think it lends itself especially to our age of radically eroded institutional authority, when we're all, so atomized. And to me, when people talk about secularization, it's a term we often associate solely with the decline of the authority of traditional churches. I think the story of secularization is one of the declining authority of institutions, full stop. And so I think we are seeing in our own time, not the development of some, new atheist materialist fantasy of, greater and greater proportions of Westerners coldly and in a calculating way navigating through the world based solely on, empirical evidence accessible to all humans, no matter their metaphysics. Rather, we're seeing this efflorescence of all kinds of really interesting and esoteric religious and spiritual practices, because that hunger still persists.
What is the reason for the collapse of trust in institutions across the board, full stop?
The Protestant Reformation?
Mm.
Can I say that on your podcast? I mean, I do. In a sense, I'm being a little cheeky, but not entirely cheeky. The story I'm trying to tell in my book is really a story about the post-Reformation West and the sharpening of certain dynamics in Protestantism as it kind of interacts with the other intellectual and cultural streams of early modern and modern Europe, and then come to their most extreme realized form, in a sense, in the context of American culture. So that is part of the story, that there is this way in which, while Martin Luther would blanch at the prospect of being seen as some kind of ancestor to much of what transpires in 21st century American culture, and of course his message was one of a call to renewed submission to the authority of the Bible. There is in the Reformation, and it doesn't come out of nowhere. Of course, we can draw a genealogy further back, but it really sort of begins to germinate in the Reformation, this seed of the radical importance of the individual conscience and the individual assent to the propositions about reality that Christianity proposes, and the importance of your own personal relationship to God. And that is a part of the early Protestant message that in its initial 16th century context is kind of controlled and balanced by other things. But as we follow that dynamic, that impulse through the centuries to the shores of America, into this, incredibly entrepreneurial, nearly free market, not entirely free, but compared to the rest of the Western world, a religious free market. I think we see the roots of a culture where the role of institutions is always a bit more tenuous than in the broader West. And I think, though, it's not a story of purely American exceptionalism, the story of Western secularization. It's that in some ways, what we see in America is the leading edge of this broader set of developments that have to do with the rise of the individual. And now I think that this is not, it's important to recognize that this is not a story in the United States of the kind of catastrophe of religious observance. On the other, by contrast, in fact, it's that sort of entrepreneurial dynamism in the American context, the fact that religiosity, Christianity in the United States is not so tethered to fixed institutions that I think has lent it relative health compared to the rest of the West. Now, there are other factors that I think we can point to be more precise about this narrative in recent history. So certainly, the second half of the 20th century, the Vietnam War, the kind of tumult of the 1960s and 70s, and the liberation movements, and the way in which so many Americans come to this more jaundiced view of institutions they once trusted. I mean, we can trace levels of trust in the polls and see that really across the board, almost every institution, maybe with the exception of the military, which tends to still have pretty buoyant trust levels, but media, higher education, churches, everything you could name, Congress, it's just gone like this, especially over the past generation. And certainly this has been exacerbated by technology, by the way technology has atomized us.
I want to talk about the 5 types of charisma that you talk about. Before I do that, let's consider with institutions a couple of test cases and that seem to me to be related, but I wonder if you would see it the same way. Look at, for instance, the decline of the power of the Republican Party as an institution, as a party. It used to be the joke that the next person in line was going to emerge in the Republican Party because it was very organized and very, in a lot of ways, top down. That power was gone by the time we get to 2016. The party very, very weak. Congressional leadership very, very weak. But what is the result of that has not been some sort of freewheeling kind of reality, but a lot of authority in the personal charisma of one man, of Donald Trump. You look also at the decline of the denominations and of these big religious institutions. What kind of Christianity is flourishing right now all over the world? Pentecostalism, which is disconnected in a lot of ways from institutional authority, requirement for theological education, so forth, much more based on charismatic gifts and on networks. But a lot of these Pentecostal groups have very top-down sort of authoritarian kinds of structures at the local level. Touch not mine anointed, so forth. Are those kinds of trends related?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's a way in which you've pinpointed how our ecosystem of authority has gotten out of whack, and certain guardrails. I'm mixing metaphors here, but certain restraining features of our political culture, religious institutional culture in prior generations have attenuated to the point that these impulses, these types of characters who've always been there now have this kind of outsized authority. Although I think it's authority that's quite tenuous. I mean, the thing about charisma is it depends on the followers buying it. Now, charismatic leaders who manage to, as Max Weber would have said, routinize their charisma in the form of new institutions and laws, achieve something more lasting. But it can have this appearance of power that is more easily punctured than we might think. And my narrative over the course of 4 centuries, as you say, I suggest that there's we can divide up that time in 5 eras in which we see the rise and fall of these different charismatic types that have a particular resonance with the anxieties and fears of their era. And there's a kind of pendulum action and reaction between the eras. And so I start in the colonial period, and I talk about the age of the prophets. And prophets in this period, which is still quite tethered to traditional Christendom, as it still exists in Europe, and they're followed by an age of conquerors who have a particular relationship to the context of the early American Republic and are more interested in building things in many ways, and we can talk about those if you like. But then the pendulum swings back after a period of relative institutional building to the era of who the folks I call the agitators, who are kind of cousins to the prophets, but they're creatures of a particular late 19th, early 20th century moment, a disillusionment with the encroachment of big institutional and government power. I talk about the experts who kind of follow in reaction to the age of the agitators, the rise of fascist demagoguery in the context of World War II. And it's natural, I suppose, for a professor like me to kind of idolize the era of the experts. We're always trying to get back to that in some sense. But the era we're in now, I call the era of the gurus. And I think that these guru figures have their messages bear some resemblance to those earlier eras of prophets and agitators, but they are operating in a deeply secularized, deinstitutionalized, atomized context where they're simply able to they have a lot more power than leaders of their type had in previous eras. So I think that's what we are seeing in some of the contexts you're describing.
Now, you talk about in the book how each of these types characterizes a particular era in American history. But would it be the case that all of them are operative? They're all present in any given era. It's just that one has more resonance?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, like any typology, it's a tool for understanding the big picture that oversimplifies in order to point things out. Almost none of the figures I talk about are pure examples. One of the big lessons, though, that I found really interesting, covering all of this territory of American history, is that those leaders who perhaps we could agree were relatively successful. George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy were not particularly pure expressions of the dominant charismatic type of their age. Rather, they were able to perceive that dominant pattern and respond to it, maybe riff on it, borrow from it, and adapt it as useful without leaning too far. So for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, especially in the later 1930s, was under threat from his left flank politically by agitator figures like Huey Long, who presented this populist message that the New Deal had not gone far enough, and that Roosevelt was just a sellout to the interests. And if you look at Roosevelt's rhetoric in the 1936 election, he definitely cheats in that direction. And his own sort of technocratic New Deal advisors are horrified by his speeches, and they call it demagoguery and what is happening? But he's responding to Huey Long, while at the same time drawing in a strategic way on that kind of technocratic, rational tradition of political leadership, telling the American people, you are reasonable citizens. When it's appropriate to trust experts to rebuild the state. So he's quite agile. And I found that to be true of the most successful leaders, because there is a sense in which all of these types are sort of a library of ways of relating to potential followers. And in no era does any one of them disappear entirely.
You talk about in the book how there are some of these aspects of charisma that emphasize fate or predestination, and others that, in almost a backlash to that, emphasize free will and agency. When you think about recent American history, for instance, from the Jesus movement and the revival movements coming out of Billy Graham, Decision magazine, the crusades that emphasized personal decision, followed by this huge kind of swing toward the new Calvinism and doctrinal rigidity and predestination, still present, but not like it was. Now, a lot of emphasis on Asbury revival, for instance. Does any of that surprise you when you see this kind of swinging back and forth?
I think it is a pattern we can trace back in American history, and there is a degree to which, for most of the history of this country since European contact, the dominant theological and philosophical impulse has been in the direction of free will. But there has always been this minority report, this predestinarian minority report. And in a kind of more straightforward theological sense, a persistent reformed tradition that has always punched above its weight, right? If you were to do a head count of the whole country, from the very beginning, from the 17th century forward, you would never be able to pinpoint a year when the majority of American Christians were Calvinistic leaning, and yet they have always had this outsized political, cultural, theological influence. I will say, though, that this question of is this what's the right way to characterize it? Is this a pendulum swing from kind of quite radical predestination that has a very attenuated view of human agency to radical Arminian, it's all on you, right? To sort of reach out and grab grace. There's a sense in which I think the believer's experience of both of those can feel simultaneously, like the magic of both of those postures is that they are simultaneously very empowering and make you feel like a vessel of divine force, while also giving you the sense that you are wrapped up in a bigger story that is going somewhere. So one of the fascinating, maybe on first glance, paradoxes of the history of Christianity is that you might expect that a very Calvinistic or Augustinian, to use a broader term, view of predestination would result in total lack of interest in evangelism and missions, right? Like, why should we even bother if God made all of these decisions before the beginning of time? And there are occasional cases in which that's true. So I'm thinking, for example, of the hard shell Baptists who, had their redoubt in Appalachia and do indeed have kind of firm strictures against overt evangelism for these kind of Calvinistic reasons. But for the most part, deep commitments to a kind of Calvinistic view go hand in hand with an enormous amount of zeal for evangelism. I mean, I think, this is true in our own time, in the kind of new Reformed, new Calvinist impulses in the Southern Baptist Convention and elsewhere. They've actually fueled missionary movements. So what's going on there, right? I mean, there's a sense, and here I see kind of echo of the psychological dynamics you see in Leninism in the context of the Soviet Union, right? Which is another deeply predestinarian system, but a system of thought in which, yes, history is moving in one direction. It's foreordained. It's as certain as the law of gravity, but humans are destined to play a role in this, right? I mean, Lenin would have called them the vanguard, right? You need the vanguard to kind of sharpen the contradictions of these periods of social change. And I see that same mentality in Calvinistic missionaries. And likewise, I would say among kind of Pentecostals and Wesleyans, in which on paper, there is this quite liberating vision of free will. I think there can too be an experience of being really caught up in the intentions of the Holy Spirit in a way that one surrenders all control, right? I mean, I ended up writing a lot at the end of this book about the Toronto blessing and its aftermath, and I wonder if the revival you were describing at the top of the episode, it was one of these kind of 1990s manifestations.
It was, yeah.
And when I talk to folks in those communities, we have fascinating conversations about the role of human volition in those contexts. So I've interviewed folks in church scenes like you described, and I've said, okay, you've told me, you were slain in the Spirit, you were down on the carpet for hours, or you could only crawl out, you couldn't stand up. Is it really true that you couldn't get upright? And they would think for a moment and say, well, no, of course, if I had wanted, to kind of say no thanks to the Holy Spirit, yeah, I could have gotten up. But I wanted to participate in this. I wanted to turn myself over to this. And so I think there is this dance of human free will and trust in higher forces in both cases.
One of the figures that you talk about in terms of the era of the gurus is a broadcaster by the name of Rush Limbaugh, who even those who don't know the name may have been too young when he came along. He really did set the stage for much of what we're seeing all around us right now. How does this figure fit into the guru model?
Rush Limbaugh, began as a man with a genius for radio comedy and sort of disruption. And there's a way in which I think that's important to understand and should come even before any conservative ideology that we associate with him. But I mean, I think that his really quite phenomenal building of a media empire and devoted followers in the early 1990s at the expense of traditional institutionalized media on this narrative that you, the listener, have been fed lies and disingenuous portraits of reality that have given you totally the wrong picture of this country. let me pull aside the veil and present you with the facts. And while we're at it, let's tear down these idols of the secular liberals. He had a genius for insulting nicknames, feminazi, and these ways of when Clinton was in the White House, it was the Oval Orifice, right? Like he had a real gift for that. So he perhaps more than anyone else destabilized the media ecosystem of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in which there was more or less a commitment to kind of professional processing of empirical information about the world, and a desire to at least aim for the asymptote of objectivity, if not achieve it, right? And it's really in the Limbaugh era of the early 1990s that we see the rise of the conservative media ecosystem. And then in response to that, the traditional mainstream newspapers, magazines, and news shows, which had not, prior to that, there had been this tradition, there had been a sort of smaller scale conservative tradition of criticizing those outlets. So don't get me wrong, but it gets turbocharged in the 1990s as in kind of response to what Limbaugh and then later Roger Ailes are able to build. And what struck me in studying this period is that so many of the patterns that observers of our current moment credit to the rise of social media and the internet, right? The rise of echo chambers and obliviousness to fact checking and the kind of polarization of the media landscape. These simply represent the continuation of trends that were clearly well on their way in the early 1990s. This is not the result of the internet age. So I do think that Limbaugh and his ability to plug into this truly cynical period in American history when there's just this collapsing faith in institutions, and his ability to build a media world out of that it's a really important milestone in this story.
How do you suppose this will be affected by the fact that virtually every, and I don't even have to say virtually, every tech expert that I know is saying American life is not ready for the transition that's going to happen with AI. Some of them have said to me, this is going to be more radical than Gutenberg. Some of them even saying it's an axial decade compared to the axial age of the beginning of literacy. Have all of these changes happening in terms of artificial intelligence. What do you think that will do to the way that we typically have related to human charisma?
I'm really worried about this. I've been working on an article asking the question, is it or will it be possible for AI agents to possess charisma in the sense that I've been defining it? And this gave me an excuse to interview some engineers and other folks at some of these companies who work especially on the latest generations of chatbots and avatars. And certainly in the sense of interpersonal plausibility and even charm, the innovations are quite remarkable. And, we are probably pretty close to an era when, you can create a customized avatar that, is trained on footage of thousands of actors to very realistically pair both facial expressions and body movements with a script. And certainly, we're seeing more and more sophisticated production of rhetoric coming out of ChatGPT and so forth. I do think AI is very good at homogenization. AI is very good. The whole model, the large language model is premised on scraping the internet and then calculating the statistical likelihood of the next token in a sequence. That's the basic idea. And so if you are trying to confect a plausible simulation of, the sort of main thread in a particular subculture, or the basic idea of a party platform based on the surveys of thousands and thousands of speeches and social media posts on the internet, you can come up with that. But as I think about the human charismatic leaders that I wrote about, there is a weirdness factor. There is an instinct to zigzag when the culture is going straight. A sense of the power of departing from the usual manual that describes how you should do things. So if we think about Donald Trump and the remarkable phenomenon of his speaking style, right, and his style of making a case. There is no, there's no chapter in Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People that gives us anything like the handbook that Trump follows, right? And it's a very polarizing approach that strikes his critics as unbearable stream of consciousness, laced with various insults, and it strikes his fans as rigorous, authentic. Exposure. The weave that has this sort of mystical genius, right? And there is a sort of mystical mode that I think he goes into for his followers. I don't think that an AI bot would get there. Or, when I think about the way Joseph Smith, right, the founder of the Mormon Church, responded in these strategic ways to the frustrations of post-Puritan New England, a hunger in this kind of hangover, this post-Calvinistic hangover for a radical declaration of free will, a new story about America that would have enough connections to the traditional biblical narrative, would sound biblical in its rhetoric, but would lift up America and put it on center stage in kind of the cosmic drama, right? And in the context of the early republic, bring to bear this particular focus on the indigenous population and evangelizing and assimilating American Indians through partly the tool of speaking in tongues, which is something we forget about Mormons. They later ban it. They're now, nowhere near, the Pentecostals on sort of the spectrum of how the Holy Spirit can manifest. But there's a way in which Joseph Smith kind of plays with this engagement with the Holy Spirit in a way that's really powerful, but not one that, if you were sort of, coldly calculating statistical likelihood of certain religious manifestations appearing in a culture, you would come up with. So this gives me some, maybe I'm grasping at straws here because I'm so worried about our robot overlords, but it gives me some cause for hope that this study of charisma actually does reveal some of what makes us uniquely human.
Does it say anything to you that here, as we're recording this, we're a day out from, even in this time of anti-institutional vibe, you have the entire world focused on St. Peter's Square, on the introduction of a new pope, to the point that the new first American pope causing the Cubs and the White Sox in Chicago to go back and forth about whose fan, which one of them he's a fan of, and all of this attention. Even though this person, most people don't know yet, so it's not as though he has this personal charismatic hold on them, but everyone seems to be focused on this in a way that, to me, feels even deeper than, for instance, the coronation of King Charles just a couple years ago. What does the response to this say about where we are and where we're going in terms of charisma?
That's a great question. I think it would be hazardous to try to generalize across the whole globe. And Catholics in the global South, I think, have a different relationship with the hierarchy than those in the West. I think in the West, though, there's a few things going on. One is probably a kind of nostalgia for institutional continuity across time. There's something exciting and attractive and comforting about thinking of yourself in relation to this institution that makes claims going back 2,000 years. I also, though, see as I survey kind of social media reactions and articles, I see a lot of jockeying among Catholics or non-Catholics who already have a certain set of commitments to kind of position the Pope in their account of what's happening to the Church. So it seems to me that there's a sense in which, in the decades since Vatican II, conservative and progressive Catholics alike have felt greater liberty to dissent from the Pope's pronouncements if they don't agree with them. So I think it's a slippery thing, to try to get a hold of what it is that constitutes the authority of the Pope for Catholics today. And then, what is going on with the deep attention paid by people for whom this is, this is a kind of outsider matter. This is a story about an institution and in many cases a faith system they don't have any personal investment in. But I have secular academic friends who are very excited about the election of Leo XIV because they see his election as a counterweight to Trump. So they're sort of squeezing the institutional story and authority and gravitas into their picture of American politics that doesn't have much at all to do with the actual claims that he who occupies the see of St. Peter makes.
The New Testament speaks about charisma directly and literally in terms of giftings to the church. Leadership needs to be apt to teach. Paul writes, and to have a good reputation with outsiders. All of these different giftings that are being recognized by the church. At CT, we had a documentary podcast series, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that I was stunned by how much it resonated with. I knew it would resonate with people who were familiar with that particular world of religious life, but it resonated with people all over the place who have had similar sorts of experiences in institutions, not always just in churches, with a leader whose charisma seems to outpace his character. How would you say that someone who's coming into a new church or coming into a new political movement or something else, maybe even an exercise class somewhere, how do you determine what kind of charisma is actually good and what may be sinister?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I loved that podcast series, and I actually cut my teeth as a journalist. One of my early magazine articles was a profile of Mark Driscoll. I went out there and spent 10 days at Mars Hill in 2010, when many of these dynamics were apparent already, but hadn't reached their full form. And I think that is a story of one man kind of elevating himself over the rule of the law of the institution. I mean, it's a story of great institutional weakness, as demonstrated by the fragmentation of Mars Hill as soon as he was forced out, and a story about a leader who presents himself as really the only lens for accurate appraisal of the world. And I think that points us to a way of distinguishing between healthy charisma and charisma that could be dangerous. So I think a leader with healthy charisma invites you into a story, helps you see things about your life and the possibilities for your own. I mean, in the context of a church, your own growth as a Christian, your own relationship with God that you hadn't seen before, helps you see your life as one in which there are many areas that were not submitted to Jesus. That now you see, something must be done, but that leader doesn't set himself up as the arbiter of what the unfolding of that story means. And as soon as he's got you into the story, his priority is connecting you with other resources and the ballast of the institution. So in the context of Christianity, you can't be a Christian by yourself, right? You've got to find a church, a community, a place to stand, theologically, even if, there are some issues that are secondary and tertiary. And every Christian subculture, every community has its own strengths, and it has particular temptations and blind spots. And I think all we can do as Christians is, as much as is practical, be in conversation and active engagement with the whole swath of the global Christian community and the 2,000-year tradition. And this is not to say, you agree with all of your brothers and sisters across the community of Christ on every point. Of course you don't. But that conversation, I think, helps you see your own community's blind spots and temptations. And it's the job of the leader to support that and make it doable, and also to embed himself in an institution, I think. And so charisma is this, Max Weber, who is the one who borrowed the word from biblical studies and church history and introduced it into social science and our speech about politics. He saw the charismatic leader as kind of this disruptive X factor in the onward march of the iron cage of modernity, right? The growth of bureaucracy, about which he had complicated feelings. And I think he saw that institutions and routinization of procedure and rules are all very good, but there is often a kind of sclerotic deadening that happens, a corruption that can happen in institutions, and charismatic leaders are the antithesis to that thesis, right? So something like that is true, I think, in the context of the church, and in evangelicalism. This is especially American evangelicalism. This is a Christian subculture with, and I'm speaking generally here, quite weak ecclesiology, a tendency toward spinning out and fragmenting, and so it is a subculture in which charisma can sometimes have more power than is really good for the body of Christ. But I think those are some questions and frameworks that it's useful for a believer to consider in the context of one's own Christian community.
The book is Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. You will find it fascinating, and it will give you a lot to talk about American life, about your church, about your neighborhood, about your household. Molly Worthen, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.